Go ahead.
All right. All right. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
All right. Hi, I'm Gavin Newman. I've taken it upon myself to develop some cool hooks for Meteor and to try to maintain the use tracker hook as best I can. And we're going to talk about a few of those new hooks and a little bit about even use tracker. So let's get started. So first, why have we bothered? Use tracker works. The original idea was actually just that I remembered how nice it was to work with tracker in Blaze, and I wanted something that felt a little bit tighter like that in React. And use tracker with tracker, they always felt like a little bit of a like an add-on. It turns out though, as I dug in, I came up with a bunch of ideas, and some other folks came up with a bunch of ideas, and we just I didn't feel like we came up with a whole lot that was markedly better than use tracker. It's actually pretty good. Another thing that I found is that it's pretty fast, right? So there's no criticism in here about use tracker or why you shouldn't use it. It's actually quite fast, and it's used by some of these hooks internally that I'm going to go over. So I just wanted to make that crystal clear. There was one use case that I felt could be improved a bit, and that is with lists. In particular, collection queries, and especially if you have a big, long subscription with a lot of documents. If you have a subscription like that, and any one property of any one document changes in the normal use tracker, it actually will cause all of the entire list to re-render, or at least to reconcile within React. So I wanted to see if we could come up with a way to optimize that to make it a little bit smoother. It also makes certain things like animations, which is actually the thing that I was working on that's sort of spawned that particular use case. It makes animations a little bit easier to work out because the references all stay stable between the updates. So to do that, so the main difference between how useFind works and how use tracker works is when you use useFind, you're just going to return from the factory method a single cursor object. So it's very different from use tracker. And use tracker, you can throw as much reactive Meteor sources as you want into the body of the function. It'll run them all, then you construct an object and return it. It's common in use tracker to stuff a lot of stuff in there. And it's actually probably a good idea even in a lot of cases. With useFind, you're really only ever going to set up your cursor and then return it. One note, you don't have to call fetch on it. You just return the cursor itself. And the reason why this ends up being faster is that it's actually keeping reference stability between updates. So whenever an object changes, it will, the hook itself will actually, it's using the observe API, and it'll actually just update the individual document in the list, making sure to create new references for each of the objects in that list so that React can do its magic and use the memo and other reference comparison tricks that React uses in its reconciliation step. So it's a relatively easy way to get a lot of performance, and you don't really have to do a whole lot of extra work. You just have to use the hook a little bit differently. This code is basically setting up a subscription, which is also super easy to use, very light feeling in its API. It will then use in a separate component, it will use the useFind hook to set up the cursor. And then it does the iteration over another component, which is memoized, right? So just to give you a closer look at that code, right? So here we're setting up we're using the useSubscribe hook, which you may notice is doesn't require a factory of any kind. You really just pass it the name of your subscription and then whatever arguments, just like with meteor.subscribe. And then you get a is loading function. That is a little bit kind of tricky. It is a function, you have to call it. And the main benefit of this is that it will only set up reactive updating on the loading flag if you actually use it. So if you're just setting up a subscription and then don't care about the loading state, it won't actually cause your entire tree to re-render. So that's one benefit here. Then we're going on into the actual list component. That's, in this example, is really just setting up the find method, and then it is returning basically a reference stable list of documents. And then in our iterators, we're really just iterating over a list item component that we have memoized using React's built-in memo function. And that is going to keep each one of these from re-rendering if when one document changes inside of the list. It also does other neat things too, like it'll actually rearrange and keep track of your document references should the order move, so that you can actually change the order, and then React can actually, using this key and its own reference checks, keep track that two DOM elements have swapped, or one DOM element is moved, which can help with some animation stuff. So this is actually pretty robust. It's pretty useful. If you're curious, you can take a look at there's just a reducer that does all that. It's not even that complicated. It's, just a couple of lines of code. So this is to me, this was pretty exciting when we got this working. It really substantially increases the speed of rendering for certain use cases. A use case that might benefit from it would be like a chat example, where you're just adding chat message after chat message. Whenever you add that chat message, it's not going to have to reconcile the entire list. It just renders the last item added to the chat. Or if you have like a big table full of stock tickers or something like that, it's only going to update the individual tickers that change instead of having to render the entire table. So to me, that's pretty neat. Use subscribe is really just a simple wrapper around use tracker. It takes care of setting up reactivity and has that one little trick that it uses to reduce the overhead of updating on the state change. If you're not actually using the state change, you can just avoid that particular update. And then here's just a couple of notes. So React does a bunch of really interesting stuff with its first render. That's that first render that happens before the render is what's called committed. In the future, React is going to be doing concurrent rendering, but it's not just about concurrent rendering. They actually call this feature, I think they call it time slicing, and it's used for things like error bounds and suspense, and also the upcoming concurrent mode, which I believe they're going to enable in React 18, maybe not by default, but they're going to definitely finally support it, even though it's been sort of on the list of things to do for years. They really mean no side effects. So one of the challenges with use tracker that we had, and it exists in use find as well, is that you really can't create side effects during that first render. So there's a lot of questions that crop up on the forums about why does use tracker render 2 times. And the reason for that is because we can't create side effects. We used to jump through a lot of hoops inside of the hook to try to create a side effect in the initial render, which is the computation that we're setting up, and then retain that when use effect confirms that particular render is going to be mounted. You can't, in order to do that, we had to jump through so many hoops that the code base became unmaintainable. We couldn't actually understand what was happening. I wrote most of it, and even I couldn't understand it. So we basically, a year and a half ago, last year sometime, I don't remember when, rewrote it to get rid of that and just do it the way that React developers say that we should do it, which is to not create a side effect during render. So what it does is, in that first render, it sets up a computation, does the initial render and does your initial query, and then throws away that computation. It kind of has to do that. It's unfortunate, but there's no way really around it. But don't fear, it's okay, because the whole idea behind React's concurrent mode is that renders are supposed to be cheap and fast. So as long as you aren't doing too much in your initial render, or if you've properly divided your code base up so that you have multiple functions, you shouldn't really have to worry about performance issues. And concurrent mode is really going to take care of a lot of that for you anyway. It's actually really kind of magical. If you haven't played with it, I recommend turning it on and seeing how your application responds to it. So that's it for the note about the internals. One note is you'll notice how the code base in the example code that I'm showing in that slide is structured. It's not doing the subscribe and the use find and the individual list rendering all in the same component. This is largely to take care of that need to try to get as much rendering as we can into that first render, but also have it separated so that we're not overloading any one individual component. So each of these components is going to run that first render in concurrent mode. Then when it commits, all it has to do is copy it over from whichever of the concurrent renders it committed, right? So here we go. This one is going to run that entire list, and then each one of these is also going to get run through concurrent mode. So this is probably the right way to structure your code. It's many smaller components is probably best to structure your code and organize it and optimize it for that first render. And that's really it for use find and use subscribe. And we already covered some of the use tracker updates, the explanation for why it does that double render. We also have added skip update function that you can pass in as the last argument, either in place of deps or behind deps in your function signature. And that has been a feature request by many for a long time. And it basically lets you compare the result of one update from tracker to the next. So you can actually check and make sure that you really do need to cause React to do its reconciliation and full render pass. I just want to caution, there may be some impulse to try to throw things like fast deep equals at it, even though it is very fast. It's not recommended because you can't determine ahead of time how long that's going to take. So for example, if you did that on a list of 100 documents, it's almost certainly going to be slower than just letting React do its reconciliation pass. The React team has spent a lot of time and effort in making sure that their render pass and reconciliation passes are very, very fast. They are cautioning against using fast deep equals to try to get around issues of reconciliation. It's better to work with the React tools the way they're designed and not try to outsmart the React developers. But one way that you could use this comparator, this skip update comparator, is if you have, for example, subscribed to a document or a set of documents and they have an update timestamp, you could actually just go through and check the timestamp, and that would be probably faster than the React reconciler to just check that one key. So there are some use cases where you might want to use this. I just want to again caution: measure first, make sure that you have a performance problem, and then optimize. Don't go ahead and prematurely optimize. And as another note, skip update is available in with tracker, so you can use that even with your old-fashioned hawks. And these are all currently available on, I always get this backwards, React Meteor Data 2.4 beta 1, I think is the version number we went with. We also have a couple of smaller hooks that we're working on. I don't know if we've released these yet. Use user and user ID. These are not super complicated. They're actually, I think they're each only 7 or 8 lines of code. They're basically just convenience wrappers. You can use meteor.user right in your render body, but if you do that, then it's not reactive. So if like some of the data changes or if the user logs out, your component won't be updated in response to that unless you put it in a use tracker wrapper, which is just a lot of boilerplate to get some basic reactivity. So I thought it would be nice to just have a use user and use user ID analogs for those. So you just import them and use those instead of meteor.user and meteor.user ID, and it will do as it suggests. It'll give you the values that you want while wiring up all of that reactivity so that you don't have to think about it. So these are again just like a way to create some conveniences that are a little bit nicer, a little bit it feels a little bit more like how Blaze used to feel, where everything is integrated. And lastly, we have use Meteor state. This one's actually really cool. So this one, if you've ever used Blaze, you might have been surprised and delighted by the fact that if you have entered some data into some state in some field somewhere or something like that, and then change some code while you're doing development, that data persists when the hot code push updates the Blaze environment. That's always been missing from React for a lot of reasons. It's actually just kind of hard to implement. So I really wanted to get that sort of system in place. It's extremely useful. The most obvious use case is for retaining form data that will survive hot code push, but also that's both in development and in production. So if you push a new version and you have hot code push enabled, and somebody's halfway through a really long form, this will preserve their form input if you're using it. It's not a replacement for React.use state, sadly, because you do need to set a globally unique ID for each use of it. So it's not. And the consequence of that is that if you use the same ID in multiple places, you could end up with some data thrashing. So you have to be careful with it. I wouldn't go ahead and use it everywhere in your app, but for certain places, especially like I say, form elements, I think this is going to be pretty useful, especially during development. And that's really it for the new hooks. If anybody has any questions, we'll open that up for questions now, and I will answer all those questions. I don't know how to do that in this interface though. So maybe Felipe knows. Philippe?
Yeah, you can read in the impact page in the website. I think we already have a question, like a guy is asking if memo is required to get the speed gain.
If memo is required, yes.
Yeah.
It should still be faster even without it, but I'm sorry, I'm going to reshare my screen. I just needed to find my buttons. Okay, so the answer is yes, it is required. You can use a different method if you want. Basically, this message object that's being passed to this component is going to be reference stable. So if this renders a second time, this message object, its reference will remain stable. So if you had it like set locally using some kind of, I don't want to give you bad examples, but if you had it set locally, it would be equals to message. When React does its reconciliation, it uses strict equality for basically everything. It doesn't try to do any like value-based comparison or deep object comparisons. It just does a real quick check for, is this the same object? So there's already going to be some advantages to using it. If you don't use memo though, what's going to end up happening is it'll just re-render the component anyway, even though it is reference stable. So the short answer is yes, you need to use memo or an equivalent strategy. I don't know if I wasn't sharing my screen during all that. I apologize. So hopefully the explanation made sense, even though I wasn't describing it.
He said yes. Yep. Do we have more questions? I have a question that I can ask here as well. Like usually in my like subscriptions, sometimes I need to skip because I have a specific condition that is not like there. And I know I already asked this by text to Kevin in the pull request, but I think that would be helpful because we can't like put a condition and put the hook inside. So I like to create my hooks in a way that the user can also skip if they want to. Maybe it's not that common, but in some case, like maybe you have two subscriptions in the same component, maybe you can argue that, oh, that's a bad design. You should have just one like subscription, or you should restructure your app. But that's the way like sometimes I do my components as well. So it would be nice to have some support to skipping a subscription or skip a find if you don't have the data to get this information back from the server.
Yeah, so the answer is that you actually can do that. So here we have for use subscribe, basically, if that first argument is anything other than a string, like if it's null or any falsy value, it will basically just return is loading function that always returns false. So you can, if you have a condition where you just don't want to set up any kind of subscription, like in this example, room, just let me know if you can't see my screen. Room ID maybe is not defined, right? Maybe it's an optional parameter. In this case, you can just use null. And just to provide some context for why this is an issue for anyone who maybe isn't super deep on React, you can't use hooks in a conditional way. So you can't put an if statement or any kind of branching statement around a hook. So you have to kind of do it within the hook. But this will work fine. Even if this value changes and React reuses the instance, it should react and update and be completely fine. So hopefully that answers your question on use subscribe. And it's similar with find, right? So in use find, we are returning the cursor. But if we had a state where we don't have let's say this is similar, right? We don't have room ID. We can just return null here, and that will prevent this from running on the cursor. So in both cases, you have a way to opt out based on the params that are coming into your component.
Okay, yeah, we just need to make sure that you have the documentation for this, and maybe you can discuss like if there is a more like declarative way for people to understand this a little bit better. And also I have a question about find one. How can I make a find one? Like is the same, like I can use find and put a find one inside, or is different?
So find one, I was going to mention that. So find one is kind of interesting. Messages.find. So the way that I'm just going to make a little scratch area up here. So the way that Meteor handles find one is internally, it's really just doing this. Right. So find one is really just that. It's really just pulling the first element off of a fetch from a full query. So we played around with a lot of different find one method hooks and couldn't come up with anything that was simpler than just like either using find one and use tracker, right? So if you really want to use find one, you can do use tracker and then do something like that, right? So if you really, oops, let's just do that. So if you really wanted to, you could use that. Now that's pretty simple, right? It's just a simple constructor. You could limit it, right? You could put limit one or however that works. It's been a while since I tried to limit something to one document. It works something like that. You could add whatever depths you want, but it's not, you see, this is not super complicated to just use the standard find one, whereas use find internally uses the cursor itself. It actually uses the observe method on the cursor. So since find one returns basically a single document without a cursor, we can't use find one inside of the use find. Originally, I actually called this use cursor because it requires a cursor, but it was a little bit too inside baseball. So we went with use find, but so it's a little bit tricky. If you really wanted to use find for this, you won't gain as much benefit as over using like use tracker, because every time the document changes, you're going to get a new reference anyway. There's no reason not to use tracker in this case. But if you really did want to use it, you could just do something like this. Or if you wanted to do it like a safe, you could use the safe access. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yep. We have another question that are there any real difference between use subscribe and wrapping the subscribe call in use tracker?
Yes, there's not a lot. I'll just show you the code. It's super simple. This is the whole thing, right? So all it's doing is setting up, it's actually just using use tracker internally. And it's using actually the new skip update to just basically make sure that you actually have requested and is ready or is loading. We inverted it. We're checking is loaded or is getting ready state, right? So it doesn't do a whole lot above using use tracker. Originally, I actually waffled a little bit on including it. I almost just left it out so that because I figured you could just use tracker. So if you've already using use tracker, or if you feel more comfortable using it, you could. One thing you might notice in here is we're not using the depths version of this. And that's just because there's no way to make sure that the args array is kept reference stable. But it doesn't really matter anyway. The truth is, using depths in use tracker is kind of a very specific kind of optimization, and I'm not actually 100% sure that it's useful in most cases. I think use tracker, even without it, is going to be fast most of the time. So, and that's especially true with subscriptions. Subscriptions are actually written and designed. The meteor.subscribe function is written to be called over and over again, because that's how Blaze always did it. Blaze always just hammered that function to make sure that it stayed relevant. So there's no cost in. So I don't know. It's meant to be convenient. It's not really meant to be a performance optimization. You can see it does very little. It's just a little bit nicer to write it this way than it would be to. Oops. If you did a tracker, you'd have to do something like that. Use tracker and then pass it that, and then do meteor.subscribe. I'm just going to get rid of this so we can compare apples to apples. So you can see there's just a lot more boilerplate with using use tracker, but it's not. There's no downside to doing it. It's just a little bit. Oh, this is probably not necessary.
There is another question that is it correct that the subscribe call stringifies args when comparing?
Is it correct that I'm sorry, let me read that again.
The subscribe call stringifies the arguments when comparing.
No, I don't think that that's true. And the answer to this is it has something similar where it kind of like knows that a subscription is already in play, but it isn't using. Depths is doing a very specific type of reference comparison, whereas internally, subscribe is doing something else. I'm not quite sure what it's doing, but I know that it works. Basically, it's doing something. I think it's doing more of a deep compare. So it's a little bit more robust than React's depths compare. You could, by the way, do that. You could make it more robust, more verbose. The stringification you might have read about when you do a subscribe call like this, and we pass, like, let's say room ID is in a number. What this is going to actually do is create through DDP an eJSON object with the subscription call, send it to the server, and then deserialize it and hand that whatever object or whatever type you pass here. It's going to decode that on the server and pass it to the publication. So if you set it as a number here, it'll be a number in the publication, or if you set it to an object here, in the publication handler, it'll be an object. But so there is some stringification happening, but it's happening behind the scenes. You almost don't even have to be aware that it's happening. It's one of the reasons why Meteor uses eJSON instead of just plain JSON, so that we can handle dates. It's one of the things I like about Meteor.
I really love eJSON, but I don't think we promote it as we should, like especially in GraphQL. Like you can have custom types that are ready in the client. And if you don't use Meteor, you need to like instantiate the object manually because you don't have the eJSON magic. So even using GraphQL with GDP, we have crazy benefits of using Meteor because of eJSON as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so convenient. You don't even notice it until you're on another platform and you're like, why can't I serialize dates? No, eJSON is not used to check that the subscriptions are identical. Oh, you know what? Maybe it is internally. That might be. I think I did remember. I think I did read something about that. It might be internally. I'm not 100% sure. I don't want to say one way or the other. It's possible. Cool. Let me know what you find. Let's post it on the forum or something.
Any other questions? Thank you, Kevin. As always, it was great to have you here. And also it's great that you take care so well of the React packages and you're always providing like new ideas and new features. Thank you for this work. And everybody's using I think everybody that is using Meteor somehow, Meteor and React, they are using this package somehow. So it's really good to have somebody like you paying attention to this package all the time. Thank you.
I appreciate it. It's a lot of fun. I learned a lot from doing this deep dive into the React internals and trying to make it all work. If anybody is curious about that code, go ahead and take a look at it. It's fairly clean now. You can actually read it, which is different than it was a year ago.
Okay, thank you guys.
All right. Thanks, guys.